What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Sovereign Syndicate, a narrative RPG in the style of Disco Elysium, which is launching in full tomorrow from the time of this video, or January 15th, and I'm able to bring you this courtesy of a review key provided by the developer Crimson Herring Studios. Now, before we dive into everything this game has to offer, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include achievements, it also includes a lot of other stuff. There's a video linked in the description below that will go over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. That said, a game like this is a pretty tame 100%, as narrative games aren't terribly difficult to play. They're really more about the story, which brings me to my second point. As this is a narrative game, the game is the story, basically. So it's very hard to talk about that in any length without spoiling something. So while I will be avoiding anything I would consider a major spoiler, there might be some stuff in here that you would consider a spoiler. And so to avoid that, I'm going to give you a TLDR here at the beginning, in that I enjoyed the game quite a bit. I think as long as the launch price is in the $20 to $30 range, which I don't actually have information for, then I think it is well worth your time if you enjoy this style of game. But let's dive in from there as to the why, kicking it off with a section on the technical state of the game, basically how the game is running. For me, I didn't really have any issues. As I mentioned in my first impressions video, one loading screen hung on me for a weird amount of time, and that was about it. Otherwise, no crashes, no significant bugs, anything like that. Occasionally, there was smaller stuff like the pathing for individual characters could be weird at times, and I think the camera could realistically use some work in certain areas of the city. There's one shop in particular, Nandy's shop, that it sort of gives you a fisheye effect as you walk around the shop, and I really didn't care for that personally. But there's other places where just like the angle of the camera could maybe use a little work, where it's super top down or just a little bit awkward. Not a huge deal, but something that could stand to be tightened up. Now from there, let's talk about the story setup and my thoughts on it. Again, trying to avoid major spoilers here, but the game is the story. Sovereign Syndicate takes place in a Victorian steampunk version of London, where we're going to traverse that town with three characters: Atticus, Clara, Teddy, alongside his robot companion or automaton, Otto. As you can tell from these characters, and likely some footage up to this point, it's also a fantasy world. Atticus himself is a minotaur, Teddy is a dwarf, and there are plenty of other fantastical creatures about, such as werewolves, and plenty of steampunk technology to make it even weirder. Overall, I think the setting really lands, but these three characters are brought together by some curious events around London itself, namely some disappearances and murders that warrant some investigation that then leads to a much grander plot that explains why these things have been taking place. Overall, I think the mix of both the setting and the actual characters, which we'll dive into a little more, come together to make a unique and interesting world to dive into, and a story that really pulled me in until about the last couple of missions. I think the first roughly 60-70% of the game is fantastic in terms of its narrative and how it builds up to things, but then the conclusion falls a little short and it feels a little quick, frankly. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's bad by any means. In fact, I think it's fine and makes sense for the story. It just sort of lacked a big finish. Things were just kind of over, and I was like, oh, well, I mean, yeah, I guess that is how that would end, but the climax wasn't as climactic as I would have liked personally, let's say. Beyond that, though, I thought the story and how you interact with it is a lot of fun, which is mostly done through our three characters, which I want to talk a little bit about here. Atticus, our minotaur, is actually also a bit of a magician, an illusionist to be specific, which apparently is a common enough thing for minotaurs in this world, as they don't like being perceived as dumb, big brutes, so a lot of them will turn to illusion magic to hide what they are. Atticus himself, though, has a bit of a drinking problem, and is certainly ruled by a fair few vices, so running through the city as him is usually a blend of the fact that he's actually a very large, menacing minotaur, or leaning into him trying to hide that fact from people, while also dealing with his own vices, which is a pretty cool character. Then we have Clara. Clara is a prostitute, but also an intelligent and talented individual who's trying to escape a checkered past. So when her fellow courtesans start dropping dead, there's an investigation to be had there. And her role in the story, I think, does a really great job of painting the view of of women, both in this steampunk version of the world, but also the perspective and problems that they might have when you have to deal with somebody like, say, Atticus. Now, by far my favorite character, though, was actually Teddy, the dwarven engineer, who just so happens to also enjoy hunting down monsters, which is his profession. Now, where the other two characters are very much sort of down in the grimy gutters of the city, Teddy is more focused and has his wits about him. And he also gets to travel alongside his companion Otto. Teddy, though, I think is a fantastic character because he is also haunted by his tragic backstory, but he's actually since went on to make something of himself, dealing with monsters running around the city that a fantasy world like this would inherently invite. This leads him to an investigation of Arsenal engines and how they've been incorporating their steampunk technology into humans in what is, let's say, very unethical methods. And that's to say nothing of his companion Otto, which can be upgraded via a side quest to become more and more of its own person, and adds a certain amount of comic relief to everything Teddy does. And Teddy and Otto together were such a departure from the rest of the game's perspective of this grimy underbelly of the city that it really stood out to me personally, which is why I enjoyed hanging out with them so much. The only real complaint here is that a little bit towards the later game, it definitely becomes more about Otto than it does about Teddy and the pair of them, which is a bummer because it separated the two things I was enjoying the most about the story overall. Now, to wrap up the sort of story section of this, I think the one thing that was missing for me would have been a perspective of the city from someone who was doing well. Teddy and Otto are certainly getting by and seem alright, but Atticus and Clara both have a very on-the-streets level view of things, and it would have been nice to see this world from someone a little more on high. So the fact that it's an indie RPG pretty much explains why that is. I think having to write an entire extra character and integrate them into the story would have been no small thing, but I do think having a perspective of someone who is actually dealing with the elites of the city and how things are affecting the people in those upper echelons would have added an interesting mix of perspectives to what is otherwise a very street-level view of things. All in all, though, as the story goes, really enjoyed the setting, the world. A lot of the characters I think are fantastically written, and a lot of that narrative up to the end is quite strong. But that brings us to character progression. How does that work in this narrative title? Well, the first time you go to play each character, which is divided up into chapters, you'll pick a starting point for them. This is unique to each character, but is more or less the same thing. A very straightforward approach, basically intimidating or menacing type of behavior, or someone who's just a little more spry and dexterous versus intelligent and investigative, as an example. You'll pick one of these starting points, which determines your starting stats, which gives you an advantage on those in the game's skill checks, which is done through tarot cards. These tarot cards are effectively dice, to be clear, but it adds a certain aesthetic to the game to use tarot cards. Basically, every time you roll a skill check in dialogue, you'll take your character's base skill plus whatever tarot cards you pull against the difficulty level of the skill check. Now, those tarot cards do have an automatic failure or win condition, which are two certain cards in any individual tarot deck. Though the tarot cards themselves aren't decks that you customize or anything, they simply are what they are. There's just always a chance of failure or success, even if your skill is otherwise lacking or incredibly good. Now, each time you use these skills, it increases the associated humor, which is effectively experience points for each of these individual skills, so the more you use them, the more they'll level up and you can pass better and better checks. Now, the thing you're the best at, you'll pretty much always be good to go on, but I did find this pretty useful for occasionally raising up lower skills, as not every dialogue check that uses the humors and your skills for an individual character is necessarily a check. You can occasionally just pick those conversation options to get the experience for that. Now, another big aspect of this, though, is your major arcana. These are tarot cards that grant your character a trait, which then comes up as extra dialogue options. Basically, if you make certain choices in quests or just any individual dialogue, you can potentially unlock extra arcana cards that give your character the associated trait, which lets you pick those dialogues, which might open up some different options for you in the long run. These are, of course, character specific, though. Now, the last big thing for character progression really is your temperament, basically how hopeful or depressed your character is. As you move about the city, this will be affected by all sorts of things, just individual dialogue, the things you see, hear, and it's kind of just the general feeling of your character. But the interesting thing is, how high or low this is can open up unique dialogue options. It either being high, low, or simply balanced can occasionally give you extra options or lock you into a certain dialogue choice in specific specific instances that, again, just add that extra layer of choice as you move through this one. Beyond that, though, as you move through the individual areas of the game, you can pick up items and the like, and some items can actually be used from your inventory to grant you extra experience and things like that towards any individual skill or even provide you more hope, so those can be useful things to look out for. But that brings us to the gameplay of the world. Now, the gameplay here is divided up into chapters. Each chapter you'll be controlling one of our 3 characters here as they move through a specific task. Sometimes these are relegated to pretty specific areas, but in many chapters you have free reign of the city's individual districts. These are individual maps you can fast travel to and then talk to the denizens and interact with them there, and this is where you'll be tackling all sorts of side content, which is a fantastic time to go around gathering experience, learning more about the city, and what you choose to do here or not do can affect the ending a little bit, but it's also a great chance to get immersed into the world they've built here, because this grimy steampunk setting alongside fantasy elements really draws you into the world in a way that feels natural and never silly in any way. It takes itself quite seriously, and I think they built it in a way where it's pretty believable. And you'll be dealing with everything from the trade of illegal goods, illegal steampunk implants that people have augmented themselves with, illicit substances, you name it. And all of that is delivered through characters that are very memorable, which is certainly helped along by the voices in your head approach that something like Disco Elysium uses. A lot of your skills and things like that are represented as different voices in your head, which add to the conversation as you move through them, which I think helps a lot break up the walls of text that you would otherwise be dealing with, which is important to note because the game is not voice acted. That said, neither was Disco Elysium on its launch, though if the game sells well, the developers have said that is kind of one of their big priorities, is getting the game voice acted, and I think it would go a long way to helping people get into this one, and while it's not something that bothers me personally, I do think it needs to be noted. But I really do enjoy the city at play here, which is helped along in no small part by very strongly written characters. Now, that does finally bring me to the Steam Deck section of the video, though, and unsurprisingly, it runs very well on the Steam Deck. I would have been more surprised if it hadn't. It does have controller support, so moving around isn't a hassle or anything, and given the game's relatively simple gameplay elements, it feels right at home on the Steam Deck, so that's a very great way to play it. The only thing I would mention is that it didn't seem to have cloud saves enabled. I don't know if that is just going to be the case or if it was just a fluke from the preview copy I was dealing with, but as it stands for me at least, it didn't have cloud saves at all. But otherwise it ran very well, and it's quite easy to play as you're mostly just clicking through dialogue. But that brings us to our positives and negatives. Now on the positive side of things, for me it was absolutely the characters and the world. While the story kind of let me down a little bit towards the end, I would say the characters involved in that story never did. A lot of them felt like fully realized people who had their own motivations and thoughts and ideas about things, and interacting with them was a real treat for me. And doing that in this unique setting that they've offered here was also a ton of fun. I would actually love to play another kind of game just in this setting alone because I think it's very cool to interact with. But on the flip side of that, we do have a few negatives, but honestly, they're pretty minor. I would say the biggest one for me is that I think the climax of the story could have been just a little bigger, maybe taken some more risk, and I think part of that is down to the fact that unlike Disco Elysium, you don't really fail so much here. Like, you can fail dialogue checks and everything like that, but it's rare that you get yourself in a situation where failure is actually on the table. There's pretty much always a way forward, which means some of the situations you can get yourself into aren't as compelling as I think they could have been, which leads to that moment at the ending where it's like, I mean, alright, I guess it is what it is. Beyond that though, my only real other complaint was that the camera can certainly be a little wonky at times, and while it's fine most of the time, there are certain points in the game where the camera can be very annoying to deal with. And then as a final neutral point, I wouldn't call this a negative because it didn't bother me that much, but do keep in mind the game is not voice acted, and if that's a big deal to you, now you know. That though does bring me to my conclusion. Sovereign Syndicate is a very enjoyable story set in a deeply interesting world. And for that, I think if you enjoy a narrative RPG and what they have to offer, or if you're just looking for something like Disco Elysium after playing that, this is certainly a great title to jump into. And I hope they wind up doing more with this world they've created because it was very interesting to engage with. So, needless to say, the game definitely gets a buy from me. I think if you like narrative RPGs, you'll probably enjoy this one quite a bit, though it is admittedly a bit of a niche genre. But that is pretty much going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.